Jonathan walked away, but he could still feel David's gaze on him, like a weight pressing against his back. Even as he stepped inside the warehouse, the air thick with dust and sweat, something in him remained unsettled. This wasn't the first time David had sought him out, but tonight had felt different. There had been something in the older man's voice, in the way he looked at him, not as a potential employee, not as another piece on his chessboard, but as something else, something more dangerous. Jonathan didn't like it, or at least he told himself he didn't. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion. Jonathan threw himself into work, unloading shipments, moving crates, keeping his head down. It was easier that way. If he just kept moving, he didn't have to think. But David didn't let him forget so easily. It started with small things. A new pair of gloves left at his station, better quality than the ones he'd been using. A bottle of expensive whiskey placed on the break room table with a note simply reading, "For the cold nights." Jonathan ignored them. Then came the more direct encounters. David would appear when Jonathan least expected him, watching from the shadows as he worked, occasionally offering him a drink after hours, always with that same amused, unreadable expression. "You act like I'm hunting you," David had said one evening when Jonathan refused yet another offer. "Aren't you?" Jonathan had replied, meeting his gaze with unwavering defiance. David had only chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Jonathan. If I were hunting you, you'd already be caught." Jonathan hadn't had an answer for that. It wasn't until a week later that something shifted. It was late, long past the usual hours, and Jonathan was still at the warehouse, finishing up the last of the shipments. Most of the workers had already left, the space eerily quiet. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Jonathan turned, already knowing who it was before he saw him. David Taylor stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably as always, a cigarette held lazily between his fingers. "You work too much," David murmured, stepping forward, the smoke curling around him. "What are you trying to outrun?" Jonathan exhaled sharply. "What do you want, Taylor?" David took another slow drag of his cigarette before tossing it aside, crushing it beneath his polished shoe. "You." Jonathan's pulse stuttered. David stepped closer, close enough that Jonathan could smell the faint traces of his cologne, rich, expensive, and something undeniably intoxicating. "You're always so tense," David mused, his voice dipping lower. "Like a man waiting for the world to strike him down again." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "I'm not playing your games." David reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Jonathan's wrist again, just like that night at the docks. But this time, he didn't pull away. His touch was deliberate, firm. "Who said this was a game?" David whispered. Jonathan's breath hitched. He should step back. He should push David away. But he didn't. For the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't move. And David smiled, as if he'd just won a battle Jonathan hadn't even realized they were fighting. Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears. The warehouse was empty, the air thick with dust and tension. David's fingers lingered against his wrist, warm and steady, a touch that should have felt threatening, but didn't. "You're wasting your time," Jonathan said, his voice rough. "I'm not like the others." David's smirk was almost fond. "I know." His thumb brushed lightly over the inside of Jonathan's wrist, slow, deliberate. "That's what makes this so interesting." Jonathan exhaled sharply and pulled his hand back, not violently, just enough to break the contact. "I should go." David didn't try to stop him. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Jonathan's. "You could." His voice was low, almost coaxing. "Or you could stay, just for a little while." Jonathan clenched his fists. He hated how easy David made it sound, how easy it would be to take one step closer, to give in just a little. But he had spent his whole life resisting men like David, powerful, dangerous men who thought they could control everything around them. And yet, David had never tried to control him. Push him, yes. Tease him, absolutely. But never force, never demand. And that was what made him dangerous. Jonathan swallowed hard. "I don't know what you want from me." David smiled faintly. "Honesty, that's all." Jonathan shook his head, letting out a humorless laugh. "You expect me to believe that?" David stepped closer, just enough that their bodies nearly touched. "I don't expect anything from you, Jonathan." His voice was softer now, lower. "But I'd be lying if I said I didn't want something." Jonathan's breath caught. This was wrong. This was dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the past, about his mistakes, about the crushing weight of everything he'd lost. For the first time, he was just here. Jonathan didn't move. David was close enough that he could feel the warmth of his body, could see the faint lines around his eyes, the way his lips curved. Not into a smirk, not into something calculated, but into something softer, almost real. That was the problem. Jonathan knew men like David, ruthless, unforgiving. Everything they did had a purpose, a strategy. And yet, when David looked at him like this, when he spoke in that quiet, measured voice, it didn't feel like a game. And that was what terrified him. "You should stop," Jonathan said, voice rough. David arched a brow. "And if I don't?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "Then I will." For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was thick, electric, stretching long enough that Jonathan could hear the distant sounds of the city outside. Then David did something unexpected. He took a step back. Not much. Just enough to give Jonathan space. Enough to prove that he wouldn't push if Jonathan wasn't ready. Jonathan wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. David exhaled slowly. "You're fascinating, you know that." Jonathan scoffed. "I'm a man unloading crates in a warehouse." David smiled, just a little. "Number, you're a man who refuses to break." His gaze darkened, something unreadable flashing behind his eyes. "And I want to know why." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Because if I do, I won't stop." David went still. For the first time, it seemed like he was the one caught off guard. Jonathan turned away, running a hand through his hair. His heart was pounding, his body tense, and he hated it. Hated the way David could unravel him with so little effort. He needed to leave. "Now, you should go," Jonathan said, voice quieter now. David didn't argue, didn't try to push. He only studied him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before nodding once. "As you wish," he murmured. And just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Jonathan let out a slow, unsteady breath. He had won this round, but deep down he knew this wasn't the end, not even close. Jonathan barely slept that night. Even after he left the warehouse, after he locked himself in his small, run-down apartment, his mind kept circling back to the same thing. David. The way he looked at him. The way he stepped back when Jonathan told him to stop. The way he wanted something from him but hadn't taken it. Men like David Taylor always took what they wanted. But he hadn't. And that unsettled Jonathan more than anything. Days passed. Jonathan tried to ignore the way his body tensed every time he felt a presence behind him, only to turn and find no one there. Tried to ignore the way his pulse quickened when he thought about that night at the warehouse. David hadn't returned. Not once. And that should have been a relief. But it wasn't. It was a problem. Because Jonathan had spent his whole life being pursued by consequences, by regret, by men who wanted something from him. He knew how to handle those things. He knew how to fight back. But what was he supposed to do when the most dangerous man in the city suddenly stopped chasing him? It was almost worse than the pursuit itself. It happened a week later. Jonathan was walking home, the cold air biting at his skin. It was late, too late, but he didn't have much choice. His shift stretched long, his body aching from hours of work. He turned down a side street, one of the darker ones, quieter than the main roads. He had learned to avoid attention, to keep to himself. It was safer that way. But as soon as he took 3 steps onto the narrow road, he knew something was wrong. Too quiet, too still. Jonathan's instincts kicked in a second before the first figure lunged from the shadows. He ducked, just barely avoiding the swing of a knife. A second man rushed him, but Jonathan was already moving, slamming his elbow into the attacker's ribs before twisting away. 2. No, 3 of them. They weren't amateurs. Their movements were precise, controlled. This wasn't some random mugging. This was a message. Jonathan gritted his teeth. He could fight. Years of training hadn't left him, but he was outnumbered, exhausted, and unarmed. Then, a voice. Calm. Cold. That's enough. The attackers froze. Jonathan turned his head, chest heaving, and saw him. David Taylor, standing at the mouth of the alley, his suit pristine, his hands in his pockets. He looked completely at ease, but his eyes were dangerous. The men hesitated for only a moment before stepping back, disappearing into the night as if they had never been there at all. Jonathan wiped blood from his lip, glaring at David. You sent them? David sighed. No, Jonathan. His voice was quiet, steady. I stopped them. Jonathan's fists clenched. Who were they? David took a step closer, his gaze dark. Someone who thought you were unprotected. Jonathan didn't like the way he said that. Like he was protected. Like he belonged to someone. Like he belonged to David. David studied him for a long moment before exhaling. You should come with me. Jonathan shook his head. I don't need your help. David's lips quirked, but there was no amusement in it. You just got ambushed in an alley, Jonathan. You do need my help. You just don't want to take it. Jonathan swallowed hard. He wanted to argue. He wanted to walk away. But the truth was, David was right. And that was the worst part. Because now, no matter how much he resisted, no matter how much he told himself he didn't want this, David Taylor was back in his life. And this time, Jonathan wasn't sure he could walk away.